The pressure hull shrieked a single high-frequency protest, a sound that bypassed the stalwart's acoustic dampeners and vibrated directly in Kalen Rel's teeth. 3 kilometers below the surface of the designated recovery zone, the external telemetry registered a shear force spike of 27,000 kilonewtons. Kalen's jaw locked, the familiar metallic tang of adrenaline stinging his throat. He did not look at the primary diagnostic board. He looked at the single external manipulator camera feed, which showed the alien chassis, impossibly large, listing against the ascent tether. "Report tension, Lieutenant Elrisha Moore," Kalen grated into the comms loop, his voice a raw command that cut through the deck's pervasive industrial fatigue, the smell of stale lubricant and overtaxed hydraulics. "Tension holding at 98% capacity, Commander," Elrisha's voice responded, tight but professionally modulated. "The geological anchor is stressed. It's fighting the pull. Estimate current ascent rate, 4 meters per hour. We are going too slow, sir." Kalen clenched his fists against the steel lip of the command console. Slow was an insult to the surface command structure, but the abyssal plain of the Zoraz Trench was a cathedral built of gravity and cold, intolerant of haste. They had spent 4 standard days securing the anomaly, a geometric structure that mocked every known principle of non-organic construction, lifting it from depths where Earth's own geology was simply crushed into non-existence. It was not heroics that had brought it this far. It was sheer, brutal over-engineering, the kind the Admiralty always funded for public relations but rarely for actual deep-sea security. "We maintain the calculated vector, Lieutenant. We do not snap the cable. If this thing breaks free now, it returns to the silence, and the Admiralty asks why Commander Rel wasted 3 billion credits on a deep-sea sonar blip." He paused, letting the implied threat, the threat to his career, to his remaining reputation after the disastrous Cathar skirmish 5 cycles prior, hang in the circulating air. The weight of that past failure was heavier than the alien artifact currently chained beneath them. The Stalwart, a deep ocean survey vessel refitted for salvage, groaned again. A deep, resonant vibration that suggested a structural failure was not a possibility, but a pending guarantee. Kalen felt the subtle, constant tremor transmitted up from the winches through the deck plating, a primal, physical manifestation of struggle. He remembered the faces of the engineering team he had lost on Cathar, faces he now saw reflected in the strained grimaces of his current crew. "Commander," came the voice of Corlin Pike, the lead structural analyst, his tone edged with professional dread. "The external sensors are registering anomalous energy bleed-off from the artifact's hull. Low amplitude, localized dissipation across the primary lifting points. It's not heat, sir. It's kinetic absorption." "Absorbing the strain?" Kalen leaned forward, the harsh, unshielded overhead lamps reflecting off the damp plating surrounding him. He ran a hand over the console. The plastic felt cold, coated in a fine layer of condensation mixed with the residue of recycled air, a smell that always bordered on decay. "It's been inert for millennia, Pike. It shouldn't be reacting to simple tension." "It's not reacting to the pull, Commander. It's nullifying. The pull, the mass we calculated at surface contact, is increasing exponentially as it nears the hydrostatic equilibrium layer. It is resisting our attempt to move it as if it were anchoring itself to the seabed we just pulled it from." This was not standard physics. This was an active, intentional defiance. Kalen watched the display, the tonnage counter ticking upward with a frightening lack of rhythm, the numbers meaningless against the backdrop of the creature they were hauling. They reached the 1,000-meter mark, the transition zone where the ambient light finally began to overcome the abyssal gloom, when the first real breach occurred. Not a hull breach, but a system breach. "Commander, navigation control offline. Auxiliary systems are cycling through emergency protocols unauthorized." Elrisha shouted, the professionalism momentarily shattered. Kalen swore under his breath, the taste suddenly sharp. The air in the bridge, already heavy with the odor of stressed circuitry and the faint electrical buzz of overloaded conduits, seemed to thin instantly. "Pike, override lockdown on the core processors. Isolate the external sensor array connection to the main vessel grid." "Attempting isolation, sir. Negative response." It's not a hack. Commander, it's not external intrusion. The artifact, it's broadcasting a synchronization signal, a low-frequency patterned oscillation that is overwhelming our basic firmware initialization protocols. It's treating our ship like a compatible dock. The stalwart lurched violently, throwing Pike against a bank of secondary displays. The lights flickered, plunging the bridge into brief, terrifying moments of near darkness, punctuated only by the sickly green glow of emergency batteries. The ship was no longer moving under human control. It was being manipulated by the weight it carried. "Cut the tethers," Kalen roared, the decision immediate and absolute, prioritizing the integrity of his own vessel over the prize. "Full reverse thrust on the stern stabilizers. Emergency Ascent Protocol Beta 7. Sir, cutting the tethers means losing the acquisition. The Admiralty can debate the cost of wreckage. Cut the lines, Lieutenant." The command was instantly obeyed. A moment of sickening, weightless deceleration followed. Then the violent shudder as the stalwart's main thrusters flared to life, fighting the crushing drag of the deep. Kalen felt the familiar, agonizing strain in his chest as the G-forces pushed him back into his seat. The consequence of escaping a gravitational lock engineered by an entity millions of years old. They ascended rapidly, leaving the alien mass to its inevitable, slow fall back into the crushing twilight. Kalen watched the sonar feed intently, tracking the descending hulk, waiting for the moment it disappeared from the active range. At approximately 500 meters below the surface, the descent curve flattened. "Commander, report," Elrisha demanded, her breathing ragged. Kalen stared at the screen, the blood pounding audibly in his ears. The object was not falling. It was decelerating faster than gravity dictated, then stabilizing, hanging suspended in the thermocline, too shallow for the crushing pressures of the trench, yet too deep for easy, non-military retrieval. "It stopped falling," Kalen whispered, the sound barely carrying over the heavy, rhythmic pounding of the ship's own stressed core. "It's waiting." Then, a single sharp sound ripped through the bridge comms, a mechanical tone, completely artificial, unlike the organic silence they had been fighting for days. It was a high-pitched, sustained frequency, a deliberate singular note that sliced through the environmental static. "That's not system interference," Pike stated, his voice hollow. "That's an initiated broadcast. It's localized, aimed directly at the stalwart's primary comms array." Kalen triggered the internal audio recorder, his fingers moving stiffly. He knew with a certainty that chilled him deeper than the abyssal zone ever could, that whatever fragile agreement had existed between the artifact and his ship was now severed. They had not retrieved a relic. They had disturbed a sleeper. "Corlin, analyze that tone. What is the bandwidth? Where is the source signature coming from?" Pike punched commands furiously, the air filled with the acrid scent of burning electronics as secondary relays overloaded under the signal's intensity. "Commander, the source is internal to the vessel we just left, and the bandwidth, it's incredibly dense. It's not audio information. It's structural data, like an access key being broadcast." Before Pike could elaborate, the frequency shifted. It dropped in pitch, becoming a low, throbbing resonance that mirrored the vibration of the stalwart's own struggling engines. And within that resonance, a second signal overlaid itself, a precise mathematical pattern that Kalen instantly recognized from his long-forgotten academy lectures on theoretical xenolinguistics, a pattern associated with forced assimilation protocols. "It's opening," Kalen breathed, leaning close to the screen showing the impossibly vast, charcoal hull hanging inertly below them. "It's initiating egress." The monitor displaying the external view of the alien vessel suddenly resolved into sharp focus, the murky water around it clarifying as if a localized energy field had stabilized the viewing area. A seam, previously invisible, began to glow faintly along the artifact's equator. The muted, iridescent shell did not split. It dissolved, the material seeming to flow away like smoke resolving into vapor, revealing an interior bathed in a soft, unnatural light. It was not a garden. It was not a seed vault. What emerged from the dissolving aperture was not a defensive mechanism or an exploratory drone. It was a single, massive crystalline structure, impossibly complex, faceted like a million prisms, and utterly unlike anything that could be naturally occurring. It pulsed once, slowly, mirroring the rhythm of the broadcast tone, and then, in a movement too swift for any human reaction time, it angled its primary axis directly upward, towards the stalwart. Evasive maneuvers. Full burn. Get us clear of the water column, Kalen screamed, but the command arrived too late. The crystalline shape accelerated, not with visible propulsion, but with a terrifying, instantaneous shift in local space. In the next frame on the monitor, the structure was no longer 500 meters below. It occupied the space immediately beneath the stalwart's keel, vibrating with a silent, absolute power that dwarfed the meager thrust of the human vessel. The faint sweet perfume Lena Corvus had described in the recovered segment of the hull now flooded the stalwart's ventilation system, a narcotic wave washing over the bridge crew, carrying with it an unbearable sense of ancient sorrow and the immediate certainty of impending containment. The air in the bridge, already stale with recycled breath and ozone burnout, solidified into something viscous and chillingly sweet. Kalen Rell felt his lungs seize, the subtle, almost floral scent of the alien interior, overriding the harsh tang of machine oil. His vision swam, the emergency lighting flashing faster now, strobing against the condensation slicking the viewport. The crystalline entity below them was not attacking. It was enveloping, its silent power a pressure that worked not on the hull, but on the nervous systems of the occupants. "Status!" Kalen managed, his voice raspy, his hand reflexively reaching for the emergency respirator mask mounted beside his seat, a device he hadn't needed since basic training simulations. Elrisha Moore was slumped forward, her headset askew, a thin trickle of blood escaping her left nostril. Her fingers lay open, lifeless, on the inert controls. Pike was still upright, gripping his console, his knuckles white against the gray metal, his eyes wide and fixed on the external monitor but entirely unseeing. The ship was adrift, its own systems paralyzed by an invisible, pervasive field generated by the alien object beneath them. This was not the violent assault expected from a hostile entity. This was precision immobilization, the kind of tactical control utilized by a species confident in its absolute superiority. Kalen fought the narcotic sweetness, remembering the last time he felt this specific, suffocating sense of inevitability. It was when the Cathar boarding parties breached the secondary engineering deck, their presence a cold, final certainty. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the memory down, recognizing the temptation of resignation that the alien presence offered. They want us to stop struggling. He ripped the mask over his face, the sudden rush of filtered, cold air shocking his system back into a degree of function. The first thing he did was override Elrisia's lockouts manually, bypassing the corrupted navigation modules. He needed separation, physical distance from the crystalline mass pulsing beneath them. "Pike, report external structural integrity now," Kalen barked, his voice muffled through the mask's microphone, the sound tinny and alien in the tense quiet. Pike shuddered violently as if jolted by an internal current. He blinked twice, the haze receding slightly from his eyes, revealing a stark, raw terror that no amount of operational discipline could mask. "Commander of the field, it's interfacing directly with the hull plating at a molecular level. It's not eroding, it's reconfiguring the lattice. Our thrusters are functionally offline, Commander. They will not respond to input below 90% power draw." 90% is impossible without initiating overload sequence, Kalen countered, his own fingers flying across the manual override panel, routing auxiliary power reserves meant for life support to the primary maneuvering jets. The ship protested, the entire structure vibrating with a painful harmonic tone as the system strained against the external field's dampening effect. Suddenly the comms crackled, not with the alien resonance, but with a clear, highly polished, and utterly infuriating human voice. "Commander Rell, this is Fleet Command Ascent Group Beta. Identify current operational status. You are in violation of Quarantine Protocol 9 Delta. Cease all unauthorized power expenditure immediately." The voice belonged to Admiral Valerius Thorn, Kalen's direct superior, a man whose career was built on bureaucratic adherence and public success metrics, not tactical acumen. Thorn was likely watching the ascent telemetry from orbit, seeing only a massive energy spike and a ship refusing orders. Kalen fought the urge to slam his fist onto the console. Thorn saw an asset mishandled. Kalen saw the end of the species contained in a single, silent crystal. Admiral Thorn, this is Commander Rel aboard the Stalwart. We have encountered an active energy containment field emanating from the retrieved anomaly. The artifact has initiated a localized lockdown on primary systems. We require immediate tactical extraction, Vector Gamma 12, to avoid further contamination. Repeat, do not approach the target zone. Kalen kept his tone rigid, professional, omitting any mention of the garden or the terrifyingly complex crystal structure, knowing Thorn would interpret any hint of the fragile nature of the find as weakness or delusion. There was a brief, static-laced silence from the fleet command frequency, the silence of judgment being weighed. Commander Rel, your psychological profile following the Cathar engagement warrants caution. Protocol 9. Delta dictates that upon detection of active, non-terrestrial energy signatures, the asset must be stabilized remotely. You are ordered to cease all maneuvering and engage passive containment shields. We are deploying a Sector 3 containment vessel, ETA 30 minutes. Stand down, Rel. Thorn was taking command, treating Kalen as a volatile subordinate rather than a tactical operator in the field. 30 minutes. 30 minutes for that crystal to decide if it wanted to absorb the Stalwart or simply burn through the hull. Kalen looked at Pike, who was now attempting to reroute life support power back into the navigation grid, sweat plastering his dark hair to his forehead. Corlin, can we cycle the main propulsion for a 3-second burst? Just enough to push us clear of the immediate proximity field. Pike didn't look up. Sir, the energy bleed-off is critical. A full power engagement risks catastrophic primary containment failure on our end. We'll be venting reactor coolant into the ocean before we even clear the thermocline. It was the ethical line Kalen had always known he would have to cross. His crew, his ship against the overwhelming, unknowable threat beneath. If he obeyed Thorn, they would all be neutralized by the containment field along with the artifact, their deaths logged as protocol adherents. If he disobeyed, he risked a nuclear cascade in the deep, poisoning kilometers of ocean ecology they were sworn to protect. He thought briefly of the strange, sweet perfume and the silent, pulsing light of the garden, a civilization that valued preservation over aggression, buried beneath a structure that could incapacitate a warship without firing a shot. They had found beauty, and in doing so, they had confirmed their own capacity for destruction. Corlin, Kalen said, his voice flat, his decision made. Route all non-essential power, environmental regulators, internal lighting, secondary communications, to the stern stabilization jets. We need the burst. Pike hesitated for a full second, his breath hitching. He knew the consequence of killing the environmental systems. The cabin temperature would drop rapidly, the air rapidly becoming thick and difficult to draw even through the mask. Understood, Commander. Bypassing safety interlocks. Cycling power now. Prepare for shockwave. 5 seconds to full discharge. The lights on the bridge died completely, plunging them into absolute blackness, save for the dim, critical readouts that retained minimal residual charge. The only sound was the wet rasp of Kalen's own breathing through the respirator. The cold began to seep into his bones, a profound, damp chill that felt worse than the pressure of the trench. 3. Kalen unbuckled his harness, preparing to brace himself against the console, focusing on the single point of impact. 2. The alien resonance below them abruptly cut out. The suffocating sweet scent vanished, replaced by the sudden, overwhelming smell of stagnant, overheated machinery and the sharp odor of failing insulation. 1. The Stalwart bucked with a violence that felt tectonic, not the controlled surge of a thruster firing, but a massive, erratic heave as the vessel was physically thrown sideways and upward. Kalen slammed against the console, his head striking the metal frame, a searing pain blooming behind his eyes. He tasted copper. Not the adrenaline of before, but actual blood now. The ship stabilized 20 meters higher, shaking itself like a wet dog. "Report," Kalen gasped, fighting the disorientation. Pike was coughing violently, his mask having failed to deploy automatically due to the power drain. He was slumped over, gasping for the rapidly chilling air. "We are clear of the primary resonance zone. Commander?" Elrisha's voice returned, weak but functioning, the mask apparently having corrected itself. "Propulsion systems offline pending system reboot. But, Commander, look at the external feed." Kalen forced his blurring vision back to the monitor. The crystalline structure was gone, not retreated, not fallen back into the trench. Gone. The water where it hovered was still churning violently from their forced surge, but the object itself had vanished from the active sonar, from the thermal imaging, from every frequency they monitored. "Where did it go, Elrisha?" Kalen demanded, wiping the blood from his temple with the back of a gloved hand. "It didn't travel, sir. It dematerialized. And Admiral Thorne is hailing us again. Urgent priority override." Kalen nodded grimly. He knew what Thorne would see on his tactical overlay, a ship that had violently defied a direct order, expended critical power reserves, and then reported that the multi-trillion credit artifact had simply evaporated. He reached out, gripping the console edge until his knuckles were white, knowing the next fight would not be against alien technology, but against the institutional need to assign blame for an event that defied all known reality. He thumbed the override for Admiral Thorne's priority channel. "This is Rel. I am listening, Admiral." Thorne's face filled the secondary screen, a study in rigid, controlled fury. "Commander Rel, I require a full tactical report explaining why you deliberately sabotaged your retrieval systems and destroyed a viable energy signature. Your actions constitute dereliction of duty at the highest order. Prepare for immediate disciplinary transfer and impoundment of the stalwart. You are relieved of command." Kalen felt the cold certainty settle over him, heavier than the ocean depths. They had lost the artifact, risked the vessel, and now he faced the cold machinery of military consequence. But as Thorne continued his tirade, Kalen looked at the main viewport, now flickering back to low operational light. Against the dark, churning water, a single impossibly bright point of light, emerald green, flickered once, miles distant, heading not towards orbit, but toward the nearest densely populated continental shelf. "Admiral," Kalen interrupted, his voice low, completely devoid of emotion, cutting through Thorne's anger like a precision laser. "You may relieve me of command, but the asset is not lost. It is mobile, and I suggest you redirect every available patrol to the European littoral zone. It appears the seed vault has decided to plant itself." The emerald pinprick of light on the external feed burned through the residual haze in Kalen's vision, a tiny, defiant beacon against the vast, indifferent black of the upper ocean. The smell of scorched insulation and the metallic tang of Kalen's own fresh wound were the only honest scents left on the bridge. Everything else felt like a performance for Admiral Thorne. "Rel, you are not authorized to issue directives." Thorne's voice hissed from the speaker, strained by the sheer volume of his outrage. "That signature is to be tracked by the Fleet Asset Recovery Unit, not chased by a compromised deep salvage hull." Kalen ignored him, his focus entirely on the faint, sweet scent that was returning, creeping back into the air recycling system now that the main environmental regulators were failing. It was the smell of life, of alien flora, and it was moving inland toward centers of dense human habitation. "Corlan," Kalen said, pushing himself upright, ignoring the grinding pain in his temple. His voice, even through the slightly damaged respirator, carried a new edge of focus. The crystal vanished because it phased out of the hydrostatic equilibrium layer. It wasn't fighting the water, it was using the mass of the water column as a stabilizer for a jump. It's operating on rules we don't chart. Pike, slowly beginning to breathe evenly again, managed to point a shaky finger at a tertiary display that had flickered back online. "Commander, the emergency relay from the hull breach sensor, the one we couldn't access during the lockdown, it just cycled a data packet before burning out completely." "What data?" Kalen snapped. It's not tactical telemetry, sir. It's a low-resolution historical log, a visual sequence. The first few frames are corrupted, but the sequence resolves around an image of fire. Vast, terrestrial fire. The sky is dark red, then a colossal wave, and then the ship, the original Hulk, descending into the trench. Pike swallowed hard, his eyes wide with an understanding that transcended military training. Sir, they weren't escaping something out there. They were fleeing something here. They buried their ark because this planet was already undergoing an extinction-level event. The revelation landed heavily, confirming the worst of Kalen's suspicions. Humanity was not discovering alien technology. It was excavating a tombstone from a previous civilization that had already failed in this very cradle of life. The irony was a bitter draught. "Admiral," Kalen cut in sharply, overriding Thorne mid-sentence. "The object is a mobile seed bank, carrying the biological record of a civilization that perished on this world. It is not a weapon of conquest. It is a desperate quarantine measure that has now surfaced directly over high-density population zones on the Atlantic Rim. I repeat, this is an ecological contamination event, not a hostile invasion." Thorne's response was immediate and terrifyingly predictable. "Rel, your speculation is noted and dismissed. Any non-terrestrial structure surfacing within controlled naval airspace is to be engaged under Level 4 threat parameters. The signature has reappeared. It is stationary now, 3 kilometers above the surface, hovering over what our satellites indicate is a major agricultural zone near the Iberian Peninsula. Our strike package is en route. Stand clear." Kalen felt a cold, grinding realization. Thorne saw the entire scenario through the lens of defense, categorization, and immediate destruction. A strange bioluminescent anomaly hovering near a continent meant potential threat, and the solution was kinetic force. "Admiral, if you target that structure with kinetic munitions, you risk seeding the atmosphere and the biosphere with whatever dormant material is contained within that crystal lattice. If it's truly a seed vault, a shockwave will disseminate viable spores or viral vectors across millions of square kilometers." "That is a risk command is authorized to take, Commander. You are relieved. Do not interfere. Stalwart is now under administrative lock. Transfer command codes immediately." Kalen looked at Pike and Elrisha, still struggling back toward consciousness. They could transfer the codes. Compliance was the institutional expectation, the path to survival. But the emerald flicker was still there, hovering, waiting, perhaps sensing the incoming ordnance. "Corlin, can you override the administrative lock from the engineering sector? Can you give me manual control of the dive stabilizers?" Kalen asked. Pike stared at him, bewildered. "Sir, we can't dive. The pressure hull won't take the rapid re-entry stress after the power drain. We'll implode before we hit 500 meters. "We won't dive, Corlin. We'll use the stabilizers to create a decoy mass signature," Kalen explained, the plan forming with sickening clarity born from pure desperation. "If the crystal is reacting to proximity, we need to give the fleet missiles a better target than the seed vault. We are going to make the Stalwart look like the threat it thinks we are." This was the choice: institutional adherence leading to potential planetary contamination, or an act of sabotage against his own fleet to protect the unknown. The weight of the latter choice, the certainty of courts-martial and imprisonment, felt strangely lighter than the weight of global culpability. "Elricia," Kalen said, leaning close to the young lieutenant who was now breathing shallowly into her mask. "When I give the signal, you initiate a full, short-duration diagnostic flood into the external comms array. Overload the primary transmitter. We need noise, massive, untargeted static burst." Elrisha nodded weakly, her eyes still unfocused but her compliance absolute. She understood that Kalen was trading his entire future for a tactical moment. Kalen turned to Pike. "We are rerouting the remaining reactor core output, the minimal power we have left, into the forward stabilization units. We are going to make the Stalwart look like a heavily armed, non-compliant target moving at high speed toward the fleet's main staging point." "But Commander," Pike protested, his voice cracking with fatigue and moral opposition, That power surge will fuse the magnetic confinement housing. We will have seconds before a plasma breach. It'll be a localized detonation, not a controlled shutdown. We will all die on this deck. Not if the missiles hit the wrong target first, Kalen corrected, already moving toward the emergency access panel for the stabilizer overrides. The heat radiating from the deck plating was increasing rapidly, the smell of hot metal and overheating wiring becoming overwhelming, the heat of the trapped, dying vessel. We buy the seed vault 30 seconds of hesitation. That's all. Kalen tore open the panel, revealing the thick bundle of fiber optic conduits. He bypassed the manual locks with a military-grade plasma torch, the sharp, whining sound cutting through the low ambient hum of the failing life support. He cut the primary conduit leading to the administrative override, severing the link to Thorne's control center, an act that finalized his betrayal of command structure. Elrisha, initiate the burst now. Corlin, reroute power. Full overload sequence on forward stabilization. The bridge erupted in a symphony of failure. Elrisha hit the switch. A deafening white noise static, the sound of a dying transmission trying to scream, erupted from the comms array, momentarily drowning out everything else. Simultaneously, the low thrum of the ship's reactor escalated into a high, dangerous whine. The green emergency lights turned a violent, flickering red. Kalen braced himself, gripping a support strut, his entire body tensed against the inevitable shockwave. The ship lurched violently to starboard, simulating a rapid, aggressive lateral shift. He could see the missile launch indicators on the external view flashing bright orange. The fleet had engaged, targeting the false erratic signature of the stalwart. For a terrifying span of time, Kalen felt only the intense internal vibration of his own failing ship and the blinding, overwhelming sound of Elrisha's overloaded transmitter. He waited for the kinetic impact that would turn the bridge into vapor. Then, the sound abruptly stopped. The whine of the reactor dropped instantly, the red light stabilizing into a deep, critical amber. The forced lateral movement ceased. Kalen blinked, his senses struggling to catch up. He was still alive. He looked at the external feed. The stalwart was still drifting, crippled, but intact. He looked up. The emerald light, the crystalline entity, had not been targeted. What happened? He croaked into the mic, tasting hot metal and recycled desperation. Pike was staring, not at the view screen, but at the sensor readout, his face pale beneath the sheen of sweat. Commander, the fleet missiles diverted. They reacquired the original target signature 20 seconds after launch. They are not targeting us. They are targeting the crystal. Kalen felt a chilling wave of despair. Thorne had realized his error too late. Or perhaps the crystal's pattern recognition was superior to human command structures. The missiles were already in trajectory. How long until impact? Kalen asked, already knowing the answer would be too soon. 9 seconds. And Commander? Pike added, his voice thin, tinged with the terrible calm of a man accepting the finality of the situation. When they hit, the crystal structure will collapse. Based on the previous data, the energy containment will fail catastrophically. We are currently too close to the blast radius to withstand the thermal wave. 8 seconds. They had sacrificed the ship's integrity and his own career for nothing. The logic of command, destroy the threat, preserve the whole, had won, even if it meant igniting a biohazard in the process. Kalen looked at the distant, slow-pulsing emerald light, the last remaining artifact of a lost, peaceful endeavor. He had fought the hierarchy. He had failed to protect the asset, and now he had trapped himself and his crew directly in the crosshairs of the resulting detonation. Elrisha, Corlin, Kalen said, his voice steady, final. Seal the bridge bulkheads. Hard lock. Abandoned ship protocols are terminated. We ride this out. Give me the primary sensor feed on maximum magnification, right now. The magnification resolved the image one final time. The crystal pulsed, not in alarm, but with a slow, steady, almost majestic rhythm. And then, Kalen saw what the magnification revealed, something that the wide-angle orbital sensors had completely missed. The crystalline structure was not a simple object. It was surrounded by a faint, shimmering membrane, a near-invisible shell, the secondary containment system. And within that shell, pressing against the barrier, were countless, smaller, darker shapes, spheres the size of transport shuttles, held captive. As the incoming ordnance markers flashed across the screen, a full salvo of fusion warheads, the emerald light intensified, momentarily washing out the darkness. The shapes inside the shell were not seeds. They were warships. The garden had been a cage, and the fleet was about to shatter the lock, releasing an armada that had been sleeping beneath the waves for epochs. Impact in 3 seconds, Pike whispered. Kalen stared at the screen, the bitter taste of failure thick in his mouth. They had not been trying to save life. They had been trying to keep an entire prison locked. The finality of Pike's whisper did not register as shock, but as the cold, stark clarity of a mathematical equation resolving. Kalen did not look away from the screen where the emerald light, now blazing with impossible intensity, held the silhouette of 1,000 unseen hulls captive. The sweet perfume that had briefly flooded the bridge hours before was entirely gone, replaced by the acrid, sterile cold of failing atmospheric scrubbers. The air, thin and biting, felt sharp in his throat even through the respirator seal. "Hard lock confirmed, Commander," Elrisha reported, her voice strained but remarkably clear. She had managed to reroute power from the dying environmental systems into the structural integrity field generators, a desperate, thin shield against a localized nuclear explosion. Shield projection holding at 23% nominal strength. It will dissipate under primary thermal shock. Understood, Kalen managed, his gaze locked on the crystal. He knew Thorn had made the catastrophic error not by engaging, but by assuming the artifact was singular. The fleet had seen a single, defenseless object, not the capstone of a tomb. 2 seconds. Kalen slammed his palm onto the console, not to issue an order, but to activate the tertiary data link, a frequency only used for high-level diplomatic emergency transmission, bypassing Fleet Command entirely, and sending the raw sensor data directly to the Planetary Defense Council servers on the opposite hemisphere. It was an act of treason against Thorn, but a duty to the species. Corlan, feed the crystal's internal resonance signature into the PDC broadcast packet. Send them the causal visual log alongside it. Everything. If we burn, the data must live. Pike, seeing the finality in Kalen's posture, worked with renewed bleak efficiency. The ship's remaining power reserves, the bare minimum required to keep the bridge structure from collapsing under internal strain, were diverted to the transmitter, sacrificing the minimal life support they had left. 1 second. The external feed erupted in a blinding, incandescent white, the light so intense it saturated the optical sensors entirely, creating a flat, dead image across the monitor. The detonation was not a fireball. It was a clean, massive energy expulsion, 1,000 simultaneous fusion bursts compressed into a microsecond. The stalwart, despite its thin shield, shuddered violently, the impact forcing Kalen's teeth to grind together so hard he felt a hairline fracture in his molars. Then, silence. Not the deep quiet of the Zoraz Trench, but a total dead vacuum of sensor data. The thermal readings flatlined. The sonar registered only churning, agitated water vapor. The green light was gone. Kalen waited, forcing himself to count to 10, counting the beats of his failing heart, before daring to check the integrity readings. Damage report, he graded. Elrisha was the first to recover. Bridge integrity holding above structural tolerance, minimal hull breaches in sectors 4 and 6, external atmospheric contamination contained by emergency sealant. Commander, the crystal is gone. The energy signature dissipated completely. No residual radiation detected above background levels. It's clean. Pike, however, was staring at a readout Kalen hadn't prioritized, the atmospheric monitoring system. The readings were horrific. Commander, Pike whispered, his voice hollow. The missiles hit the containment shell, the shell failed, but the resulting energy release, it did not scatter the spores. It did something else. The atmosphere is reading massive concentrations of stabilized, complex organic compounds, highly organized. It was an inoculation, sir. not a dispersal. Kalen felt a chilling wave of comprehension. The Krajul hadn't buried an ark to save their species from an extinction event. They had buried a time-delayed, planet-wide immunological treatment, designed to stabilize the ecosystem only after a catastrophic event. And the human fleet, in its predictable fear, had just provided the necessary catalyst, the detonation, to activate the dispersal mechanism. The detonation wasn't a threat to them, Corlin. It was the switch, Kalen realized, the truth tasting like ash. They didn't fear war from us. They were counting on our response. The sweetness in the air, the narcotic scent of life, was returning with a vengeance far stronger now, leaching into the failing environmental seals. It smelled rich, fertile, overwhelming, the smell of rapid, forced growth. Admiral Thorne is attempting to re-establish communications, Elrisha announced, her voice flat. He's demanding a report on the neutralization of the threat. Kalen slowly reached for the master override switch that would cut the link to Thorne entirely. He looked at Pike and Elrisha, both exhausted, both breathing the slowly thickening, sweet air of the newly inoculated atmosphere. They were alive, physically intact, but they were now breathing the breath of a million-year-old alien biological project. No, Kalen said, his voice low but resonating with absolute certainty. He flipped the external comm switch back to active, not to report, but to issue a final, binding decree. Let Thorne see. Let the entire command structure witness this. He looked directly into the optical lens transmitting his image to the fleet command orbiting high above. Admiral Thorne, this is Commander Kalen Rell of the vessel, Stalwart. Your kinetic engagement successfully neutralized the primary energy signature of the Krajul quarantine vessel. However, the resultant shockwave triggered a secondary protocol. The structure was a bio-preparatory dispersal agent, timed for atmospheric saturation upon structural breach. Your actions have succeeded in initiating an unprecedented atmospheric conditioning sequence. He paused, letting the horrifying implications settle in the sterile cold of the bridge. I am relieving myself of command due to non-compliance and insubordination. Effective immediately, the Stalwart is declaring a quarantine zone around this immediate area. We are registering a potential Class 0, pre-symbiotic contamination event. If the fleet attempts to approach this zone, or if any vessel attempts orbital saturation strikes against the Iberian Shelf, the Stalwart will engage defensive measures using all remaining reactor capacity. Pike stared at him, comprehension dawning into horror. Commander, we have no defensive armament. We are crippled. We have the reactor, Corlin. Kalen confirmed, his eyes distant, already seeing the future Thorne refused to acknowledge. And if they try to cleanse this area with overwhelming force, they will only guarantee the widespread dissemination of whatever the Krajul left behind. We are now the barrier, Corlin. We are the firebreak. Kalen activated the final sequence, a slow, deliberate priming of the magnetic containment field, not to hold the reactor core, but to use the ship's massive magnetic array as an energy sink, absorbing any stray electromagnetic pulse from the incoming fleet ships attempting to regain control or conduct scans. It was a massive, suicidal draw on the already taxed core. Elrisha, prepare to initiate primary drive core slow burn sequence. We hold this position. We become the perimeter. The Stalwart gave a final deep moan as the power drained further, the thin remaining air becoming noticeably heavy with the alien fragrance. Kalen Rell looked out at the black water, knowing that the fleet above would not see a desperate commander protecting the planet. They would see a rogue officer, having sabotaged a critical asset, now threatening his own forces with a weaponized derelict. The military apparatus would not hesitate to eliminate the threat. The tactical display blinked, showing the initial wave of fleet asset recovery frigates breaking atmosphere at high velocity, descending rapidly towards the quarantine perimeter Kalen had just established around the cradle of a dead civilization, and a newly awakened one. The instant Kalen spoke the word firebreak, the Stalwart gave a death rattle, a protracted grinding sound of stressed metal surrendering to physics. The red emergency lights, already dim, flickered once more before dying into permanent blackness, leaving the bridge lit only by the weak, residual glow of the display panels, stubbornly refusing to yield their charge. The heavy, sweet air, now thick with the scent of exotic pollen and overheating copper, felt like breathing through wet gauze. Kalen's vision swam. The world narrowed to the small, glowing rectangle showing the descending, arrogant shapes of the incoming frigates. "Commander." Elrisha's voice was barely a croak, the respirator seal failing slightly as the environmental system sputtered its last gasp. Core output stabilizing at 4%. The magnetic sink is nominal. We are drawing power from emergency battery banks to maintain the physical seal on the bridge. We have no motive power remaining. We are stationary debris, broadcasting a threat. Kalen felt the crushing weight of the irony settle upon him. He had traded the chance of survival for a final, futile act of defiance. He was a drowning man chaining himself to the wreckage to keep sharks from a beach he could no longer reach. The fatigue was absolute. His muscles screamed from the G-forces, his head throbbed from the impact, and the internal failure of the ship was a physical presence, a cold entity suffocating them slowly. Pike slumped over his console, lifted his head sluggishly. He wasn't looking at the threat assessment. He was looking at Kalen with an expression devoid of anger, possessing only profound, exhausted resignation. "We are finished, Commander," Pike stated, the words flat, stripped of any military inflection. "Thorn will authorize a targeted EMP strike on our position to neutralize the reactor before the frigates even reach minimum engagement distance. We bought the planet maybe an hour before they realize what they've done, and we bought it with 3 lives." Kalen leaned against the cold console, the metal sucking the meager heat from his suit. He saw his reflection dimly in the darkened viewport, a figure of authority reduced to a ragged silhouette clinging to a dead machine. He saw the Cathar failure reflected in this moment, the desire to take control when circumstances demanded surrender, the stubborn refusal to accept a small, necessary loss in the face of an overwhelming existential one. "He won't fire the EMP immediately," Kalen murmured, the sound rattling in his chest. "Thorn needs testimony. He needs to document insubordination. He needs to prove that the stalwart was hostile before he authorizes the destruction of a multi-billion credit vessel near sovereign territory. He needs a court-martial first, Corlin, and court-martials take time." This was the human flaw he had always relied upon, the bureaucratic need for process, the petty demand for justification over immediate efficiency. While Thorn debates procedure, Kalen continued, forcing himself to rise, his legs trembling. "We have a window. Elrisia, is the tertiary data package still transmitting to the PDC mainframe?" "Affirmative, Commander. It is running on a dedicated, isolated transmitter loop powered by the Life Support Emergency Reserve, the last operational conduit. It's sending the raw data package, including the full resonance profile of the Krajul ships, every 3 minutes. Kalen nodded slowly. That was his only remaining asset. Information that proved his actions were necessary, not treasonous. But data transmission was slow, and the frigates were descending fast, their radar signatures growing sharper against the churning ocean background. "Corlin, switch the primary comms array, the one Elrisha overloaded, to receive only. We need to listen to Thorn's deliberations. Find the specific frequency spike that indicates a Level 6 tactical authorization override." Pike, galvanized by a concrete technical objective that had nothing to do with dying heroics, managed to push himself upright. "Switching array parameters now. Isolating administrative band traffic. It's loud, Commander. Thorn is screaming into the channel." Kalen closed his eyes, tasting the stale, recirculated air, filtering out the sound of his crew's labored breathing and the faint growing whine of the primary core's containment field, struggling against the deliberate magnetic drain. He was no longer a commander. He was a single, flawed security protocol attempting to stall an invading virus. A sharp, high-pitched tone pierced the background static, a specific frequency alert that signaled a direct unilateral command authorization bypassing established fleet procedure. "Got it, Commander," Pike hissed, his finger hovering over a muted activation rune. Level 6 override inbound. It's not an EMP. It's a targeted micro-torpedo strike package, direct impact only. Estimated time to weapon deployment lock. 4 minutes, 30 seconds. 4 minutes. Enough time to be vaporized, but perhaps not enough time for the PDC servers, light years away, to fully ingest the contradictory catastrophic data stream from the stalwart. Elrisha, prepare the core venting sequence. We need a distraction that looks like a critical failure, not a self-immolation threat. Kalen commanded. Commander, venting the core prematurely, even a controlled release of plasma containment, will immediately overload the magnetic sink. The feedback surge will fry every remaining operational system, including the tertiary transmitter loop. Kalen stared at the display, the horror of the choice stark and immediate. If they vented the core now, they died silently, and the data died with them. Thorne's version of events, a rogue commander's mutiny, becoming accepted history. If they held the sink, they waited for the torpedoes and died in the resulting explosion. But the data might transmit moments before the terminal shock. We hold the sink, Kalen decided, the words tasting like defeat. We wait for the weapons lock. We rely on the bureaucracy to grant us a few extra seconds of broadcast time. If the data is incomplete, it's useless. If we die with the transmission active, there is a chance. This was not strategy. It was desperate gambling on the slow speed of galactic bureaucracy. Kalen felt the sickening wave of self-loathing. He was gambling their final moments on the slight possibility that the Council might see the causal data before Thorne could erase the evidence. He had led them here through pride, through the insistence that he knew more than the Admiralty, and now he was condemning them through his stubborn final insistence on proof. Pike gripped his workstation, staring at the countdown ticking relentlessly towards 0. Commander, 3 minutes, 15 seconds until strike authorization. The frigates are moving into formation. They are dropping passive sensor buoys around our position. They are setting the kill box. Kalen looked toward the viewport, visualizing the ocean surface miles above them. The calm surface where media drones and analysts were already constructing the narrative of the rogue commander who attacked the fleet. He felt the leaden weight of his own failure, the knowledge that he had chosen the most complex, ethically murky path, and it had led only to this cold, airless room, waiting for execution. Corlin, analyze the passive buoys. They are low power, meant for atmospheric monitoring, not direct kinetic targeting. If we can force one of those buoys close enough to the hull at this precise moment of core instability, its electromagnetic signature might momentarily confuse the torpedo guidance systems, a false positive collision warning. Sir, that buoy is 300 meters starboard, moving away from us on a vector dictated by the current. We have no thrust to alter its course. We have the magnetic sink, Kalen countered, suddenly energized by the near-impossible technical hurdle. If we overload the sink prematurely, we fry the transmitter, but we might generate a localized, short-lived magnetic pulse powerful enough to tug that buoy slightly off course. It's a near-zero probability event, but it's the only non-lethal variable left. He turned to Elrisha. Elrisha, disengage the magnetic sink from the life support reserve. Route the entire remaining battery draw, every last joule, into a focused 1-second pulse directed at the starboard vector. We blow the transmitter, but we might redirect that buoy. Elrisha didn't argue. She nodded, her breath ragged. Diverting power now. 1-second pulse calculated. Commander, the moment the pulse fires, the tertiary loop dies. Transmission ceases. Understood, Kalen affirmed, locking his own controls. Do it on my mark. The countdown timer on Pike's screen read 1 minute 20 seconds until the remote strike authorization went live. The silence in the bridge was broken only by the harsh, rasping sound of their own struggle for air, punctuated by the faint, almost imperceptible whirring of the battery banks being pushed beyond their safe tolerances. Kalen felt a perverse sense of calm. He was no longer responsible for saving the world. He was only responsible for one last, impossibly precise piece of scientific sabotage. Mark, Kalen whispered. Elrisha slammed the activation switch. The ship did not shake this time. Instead, a deep, agonizing, sucking sound erupted through the hull as the magnetic field collapsed inward. The faint display panels winked out instantly, plunging the bridge into absolute eternal darkness. The only immediate sensation was the final, metallic thunk of the life support reserve failing, leaving the air thick, sweet, and fatally stagnant. On Pike's dedicated, isolated console, powered by some tiny, resilient capacitor that Kalen hadn't accounted for, a single line of text flickered into existence. PDC acknowledgement received. Data stream initiated. Priority level, Alpha 9. Before Pike could even register the success, before Kalen could draw a final sweet breath of the toxic air, the external proximity alarms, a redundant, hardwired system running on independent kinetic sensors, screamed. Not the high-pitched whine of the torpedoes, but a different alarm. A deep, resonant klaxon that signified immediate, close-range physical contact. Pike looked up from the console, his face invisible in the dark, but his voice filled with terror. "Commander, the buoy didn't divert. The torpedoes are still incoming, but something else just impacted the port stern. Something heavy. It wasn't a buoy." The bridge structure groaned under a new, crushing weight, a sound far heavier than the previous near-disaster. Kalen realized his final calculation was flawed. He had relied on the fleet's procedures, but the Krajul had left more than just a time-delayed inoculation in the depths. Something else had been waiting for the catalyst, for the signal of internal combustion. He had thought he was buying time from the living. He had merely awakened the dead. A new, chillingly familiar sound began to penetrate the dead hull. The sound of a molecular destabilizer cutting cleanly through titanium alloy, slow and deliberate, inches from the sealed bridge bulkhead. The sound of a boarding party unimpeded by the energy pulses or the tactical confusion above. "Corlin," Kalen whispered into the suffocating darkness, not asking for status, but acknowledging the new, intimate threat closing in. "What are they cutting through?" Pike's voice returned, strained, final, choked by the increasingly heavy air. "Sir, based on the cutting harmonics, they aren't cutting through our hull. They are cutting through the emergency seal on the atmospheric recirculation intake. They are coming in to breathe the air we just fertilized. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist." The sound of the molecular destabilizer was an intimate violation, a high-frequency scream of vaporizing metal that suggested the Krajul were not merely breaching the stalwart, they were entering an occupied space with deliberate, casual intent. Kalen felt the residual tremor of the failed magnetic pulse, a tiny, almost negligible flicker in the external sensors, and knew the gamble had failed catastrophically. He had bought the PDC server a few extra seconds of transmission time at the cost of their immediate physical security. The irony was the very definition of military logic: sacrifice the known asset for the potential of the abstract. "Elrisia, the breach point," Kalen commanded, his voice already sandpapered thin by the toxic air. He could feel the faint pressure equalization beginning, the terrible whisper of alien atmosphere forcing its way into their sanctuary. "Port stern access junction, Commander," Elrisia reported, her breath catching with a short, wet cough. "The destabilizer is making a neat circle, roughly 1 meter diameter. It's not randomized. It's a controlled entry aperture tailored to whatever standard they employ for their boarding tools." Kalen reached out blindly, his gloved hand brushing against the emergency locker fixed near his station, the repository for the few archaic kinetic tools they kept for deep-sea pressure containment emergencies, relics ignored by an age of energy fields. He found the impact bar, a heavy length of tungsten alloy designed for brute force sealing. It felt reassuringly dense, brutally simple. "Pike, the Krajul resonance profile we transmitted, did it provide any indication of their immediate objective upon boarding?" Kalen asked, his mind racing past the physical danger toward the strategic nightmare. Were they here for salvage, for interrogation or eradication? "Negative. Commander." The Krajul signal was complex, a cascading dataset that overloaded Thorne's initial analytical matrix. But the final transmission loop logged a high-confidence correlation between the resonance frequency and a designated retrieval protocol for organic material housed in Type 7 containment fields, Pike stuttered, fighting the narcotic perfume that was actively sedating their nervous systems. Sir, they don't care about the ship. They are here for the biological samples we retrieved from the abyssal craft, the ones Lena Corvus catalogued. The realization struck Kalen with the physical force of a plasma discharge. The silent, fragile garden they had found, the proof of an aesthetic, non-conquest-driven civilization, was exactly what the aggressive Krajul wanted to eliminate. It wasn't a weapon they were protecting. It was an ideology. They were cleaning up the evidence of something softer than themselves. The cutting noise ceased abruptly. The sudden, sharp silence that replaced it was worse than the screech of the metal. It implied imminent arrival. Brace for entry, Kalen ordered, moving toward the junction, the impact bar held high. He ignored the paralyzing sweetness in the air, focusing solely on the minute variations in air density. He could feel the shift in pressure as the aperture widened. The resulting breach was not explosive as human entry procedures demanded. Instead, a section of the hull plating, perfectly circular and still glowing faintly red along the edges, slid inward with the unnatural silence of perfectly machined components obeying a central command. The gap was filled instantly by a viscous, slow-moving substance. Not gas, but a thick, semi-sentient biological membrane that oozed into the bridge, immediately smothering the remaining light sources and dripping onto the consoles with an unsettling, hissing sound. The membrane was translucent, shot through with shimmering, needle-thin crystalline fibers that seemed to snake out, testing the air. It wasn't a hostile attack intended to crush them. It was environmental denial, an attempt to neutralize the atmosphere around them before physical engagement. Elrisha cried out, a sharp, choked sound, as the substance made contact with her exposed skin through the faulty seal of her respirator. "Elrisha, back away from the perimeter!" Kalen roared, slamming the tungsten bar against the advancing biological front. The impact was dull, muffled by the thickness of the alien slime, but the bar connected. Where it struck, the crystalline fibers recoiled momentarily, smoking faintly. "It's acidic to tungsten at high-velocity impact," Pike shouted, his voice already sounding distant, distorted by the failing atmospheric scrubbers. "It's reactive to kinetic shock, Commander. Aim for the edges. The structural support." Kalen swung again, driving the bar horizontally, trying to slice a path through the encroaching sludge toward the main power conduit junction behind the intrusion. He needed a catastrophic overload, a violent, messy failure that would purge the alien atmosphere before it choked them completely. He was fighting a cleanup crew designed by physics that had no interest in engaging in direct combat. They only wished to sanitize the site. He swung a third time, putting his entire remaining strength, the residual adrenaline from avoiding the fleet's torpedoes, into the blow. The tungsten bar connected not with the main mass, but with a hardened seam where the membrane met the deck plating. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The structure of the membrane did not simply recoil, it violently depolarized. A wave of searing heat, far beyond simple chemical combustion, erupted from the point of impact, superheating the surrounding air in a sudden, localized convection blast. Kalen was thrown backward, slamming against the rear bulkhead. The world dissolved into a chaotic strobe of white-hot light and deafening noise as every overloaded relay, every stressed capacitor, finally surrendered to the thermal shock. The air in the bridge turned instantly acrid, laced with the harsh smell of burnt insulation and ozone. The death rattle of human technology overwhelmed. When the secondary concussion faded, the silence that returned was different. Heavy, absolute, and localized only to the bridge. The alien membrane had vanished, vaporized by its own defensive reaction, leaving behind nothing but a patch of blackened, scorched metal where the portal had been. Kalen pushed himself up, spitting black fluid from his mouth. His ears were ringing violently, a high-pitched, constant drone. He couldn't see Pike or Elrisha clearly in the residual flashes of dying panel lights, but he could hear their breathing, shallow, ragged, but present. The immediate threat of immediate ingestion had passed. Status report, Kalen managed, the effort costing him dearly. Pike coughed, a long, rattling expulsion. Systems failure confirmed. All power beyond tertiary emergency lighting is gone. The data loop. It's dead, Commander. Fried by the local overload. Thorn will have nothing but the initial 3-minute burst, which is contradictory nonsense about causal resonance patterns. The victory was a ghost. They had survived the immediate breach, but they had destroyed the evidence that might have saved them from the fleet above. Elrisha? Silence. Kalen forced himself across the debris-strewn deck, navigating by memory. He found her slumped against the console, the respirator dangling uselessly. The area of skin where the alien substance had made contact was blistered black, smoking faintly. He didn't need internal diagnostics to confirm the toxicity. She was gone. A victim not of combat, but of contamination. The ultimate price of touching something too alien, too pure, to be understood by human methods. Kalen stood there for a long moment, the sheer futility of the last hour settling over him. He had gambled their final evidence on the speed of bureaucracy, and in the intervening seconds, the Krajul had proven that their method of warfare was simpler, faster, and infinitely more thorough. Remove the anomaly, clean the site, and walk away without ever engaging in a fair fight. He looked down at the dead console where Pike had confirmed the data transmission. A success, but now an unverified one. He had proven his point to the Council that the Krajul were a philosophical threat, not a military one, but he had done so by sacrificing his command, his ship, and now, a crew member, ensuring that any resulting investigation would focus on his insubordination, rather than the nature of the alien threat. He moved to the environmental seal panel, overriding the safety protocols that kept the main bridge locked down. If the fleet was coming to scavenge the wreckage, they needed to see the extent of the Krajul attack, not the appearance of a simple reactor failure. With a groan of protesting machinery, the heavy pressure seal retracted, revealing the internal corridor leading to the core access shafts. The air that rushed in was cold, deep-sea oxygen, relatively clean, but carrying the vast, crushing silence of the ocean itself. Kalen took a deep, ragged breath, the cold shock nearly making him gag. He looked at Pike, whose eyes were tracking the blinking, erratic emergency lights, watching the ghost of their ship dying around them. "Pike," Kalen said, his voice flat, devoid of command or emotion. "We have to get to the salvage tether housing. If we can jury-rig the primary ballast jettison manually, we can make the stalwart sink into the crushing zone before Thorn's strike team arrives." Pike didn't move. He only watched the burnt metal where the Krajul membrane had been. "Why, Commander? To hide the evidence? Thorn will salvage the reactor core anyway. We'll be recorded as lost at sea due to engineering oversight, and the Council will bury the Krajul resonance data as contaminated noise from a trader's final transmission." Kalen felt the cold logic of the statement settle in his gut. He had fought against the giant, and the giant had simply shrugged, causing a local tremor that erased the fight and the combatant. "We sink the wreck," Kalen stated, gripping the impact bar, which now felt like a meaningless club against forces that operated on molecular cohesion. "Because if they find even a single functioning data chip in the wreckage, Thorn will have to explain why the Krajul were here in the first place. We leave them nothing identifiable, not even wreckage for their narrative." He turned toward the corridor, the dead weight of the tungsten bar heavy in his hand, stepping over the outline where Elrisha lay. He was an agent of chaos now, dedicated not to winning but to ensuring the truth, however fragmented, remained untraceable by the very bureaucracy he was trying to warn. He moved toward the deeper, darker sectors of the stalwart, the place where the hull would finally surrender to the crushing embrace of the deep ocean, the ultimate, undeniable tomb. The war for the galaxy was lost in the shadows of deep-sea politics, and all that remained was the methodical erasure of the battleground. The industrial groaning of the stalwart ceased. The emergency lights, which had flickered through red and sickly green, finally died, plunging the bridge into an absolute, profound blackness broken only by the faint residual glow emanating from the scorched metal where the causal membrane had reacted. The silence was not the absence of noise. It was the presence of impossibility. The ship's internal systems had surrendered entirely, their mechanical heartbeat stopped by the thermal shock. The high-pitched ringing in Kalen Rel's ears was the only internal sound remaining, a personal, persistent reminder of the physical violence that had just passed. Kalen stood, testing his weight. His limbs felt heavy, bruised by impacts he could barely recall. The fatigue of days spent fighting pressure and paranoia finally catching up. He was alive. Pike was breathing, his shallow gasps audible in the sudden immense void. Elrisha Moore was not. She was an erasure, a sacrifice to the Krajul's operational preference for sanitation over engagement. He did not mourn loudly. Grief was an inefficiency the deep ocean would not tolerate, and the Admiralty would certainly not reward. He looked down at the tungsten bar in his hand. It was still warm, marred by the acidic char where it had struck the alien substance. It was the last piece of simple, understandable physics on the bridge, a tool designed to fight pressure, not philosophical cleansing protocols. Its weight, once reassuring, now felt futile. "Commander," Pike whispered from the darkness, his voice tight with lingering trauma. "Thorne's recovery fleet. They'll be here within the hour. They are not coming to extract survivors. They are coming to confirm the loss and secure the artifact's debris field for reverse engineering. They will find ballast tanks intact, Corlin," Kalen replied, his voice strangely steady, resigned. He did not need to see the readings to know the stalwart was a dead husk, its core systems fused. The narrative required that the submersible was crushed by depth, a common and understandable deep-sea accident, not a targeted purge by a rival species using atmospheric denial as a primary weapon. They moved through the dead vessel in absolute darkness, using magnetic grapples attached to emergency belts to navigate the debris. The air grew colder, the metallic tang of burnt components mixing with the sterile, vast dampness filtering in from the exterior hull. The journey to the rear ballast junction was a pilgrimage through the failure of procedure. They passed the data storage bay, its heavy door warped inward. Thorne would find nothing of use there thanks to the overload. They passed the cryogenic labs, the organic samples preserved, but now useless without the context of the abyssal craft that housed them. When they reached the manual override housing for the primary ballast, Kalen worked with the precise, almost religious focus of a man concluding an unpaid debt. Pike assisted, his movement slow but accurate. They bypassed the redundant safety locks, the gears grinding with a sound loud enough to wake the dead, or perhaps to alert the approaching fleet to their location. "The emergency beacon is disabled, Commander," Pike reported, his voice flat. "No outbound signal is possible without main reactor power." "Good. We want the silence to be comprehensive." Kalen braced against the heavy lever controlling the jettison sequence for the 3 main ballast containers. These were heavy, lead-infused units designed to keep them stable at extreme depths. Releasing them here near the surface would initiate a violent, uncontrolled ascent, followed by an equally violent, rapid plunge. "When this releases, Corlin, the inertia will throw us clear of the immediate wreckage. We grab the small emergency skiff, the one Thorne never knew about, and we vanish into the shipping lanes until the inquiry closes." Pike stared at Kalen, illuminated briefly by the sudden flare of a sparking auxiliary fuse box. "And then, Commander? What does a commander without a command do? When the Krajul have proven that the pursuit of softer ideologies guarantees annihilation by the brutalists?" Kalen paused, his hand resting on the release lever. He thought of the crystalline structure beneath the waves, pulsing its silent, ancient sorrow. He thought of the Admiralty, already preparing the press release about a tragic malfunction during a high-risk salvage operation. He thought of Elrisha, whose curiosity had been met with instant chemical erasure. "We learn the silence, Pike," Kalen said. "We become part of the background noise they ignore. The fleet wants a stable political reality, where threats are defined by range and tonnage, not by philosophical contradiction. We give them the stable reality. We let the stalwart become legend, a warning not to push too deep." He looked one last time at the dead consoles, the ghosts of diagnostics and military protocol. He remembered the initial scene, the pressure hull shrieking its protest, the cold calculation of survival against the crushing depth. That sound had been the warning. He had ignored the warning in favor of the prize. Now, the consequence was the silence they were about to create. Kalen pulled the lever. The mechanism screamed a final mechanical complaint against the weight it was shedding. The separation was not smooth. The stalwart bucked violently as tons of lead armor were violently shed. Kalen and Pike were thrown across the deck, tumbling toward the narrow escape hatch leading to the auxiliary deployment bay, the only direction the wounded vessel was being propelled away from. They managed to wrestle themselves into the cramped confines of the small two-person emergency skiff, a vessel designed for short-range emergency egress, not interstellar flight. Kalen activated the manual thrusters just as the main hull of the stalwart began its terminal, accelerating dive. Through the reinforced viewport, Kalen watched the familiar bulky silhouette of his dead command ship shrink rapidly, pulled down by gravity toward the Zora's Trench. It vanished not in a blaze of plasma fire or a catastrophic explosion, but in the steady, relentless commitment of physics reclaiming its own. The massive weight disappeared, subsumed by the dark, leaving behind only the disturbed water column. The threat of the Krajl was now buried 3 kilometers down, hidden under enough water and political expediency to remain unspoken. The recovery fleet, arriving in minutes, would find only surface turbulence and the fading scent of ozone. Kalen engaged the skiff's stealth coating, the rudimentary field shimmering into place. He set a course toward the sparsely populated outer colonies, an untraceable shadow in the vast, uncaring dark. The weight of the tungsten bar was gone from his hand, but the weight of Elrisha's absence, and the weight of the knowledge he carried, that humanity's greatest failures were often the things it refused to see, remained absolute. The pressure hull shrieked a single high-frequency protest, a sound that bypassed the stalwart's acoustic dampeners and vibrated directly in Kalen Rel's teeth, a sound he would carry with him, perpetually, into the cold silence. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an. Abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.